Once every 2 years, the people of Stromer celebrate the Odo Festival, a festival that lasts 6 months and the entire continent celebrates. During the celebration, they would honor the spirits of the dead who are supposed to visit the land of the living. Spirits of the children, adults, the elderly, and even the spirits of animals would return to visit. Spirits that would be honored and represented by masks, songs, and dances throughout the nights. Not too dissimilar from what Adansi celebrates on both Lockhart and Earth. Still, here, she isn't the lady of the pumpkin house. That did not mean that the Odo Festival wouldn't have opportunities for her to get close to the Patriarch. As the first days of the Odo Festival grew closer and closer, the Patriarch and his people prepared for the festival across the continent. Even the Patriarch's spouses and children arrived in preparation for the festival. Part of the process for unifying the continent meant that the leaders of each kingdom had to be tied to the Patriarch in some way. So through marriage and adoption, the Patriarch had a claim to each of the 4 kingdoms of Stromer, and each of the 4 kingdoms had a claim to his title. The surrounding villages and farms of Cypoli watched as the procession of the 4 kingdoms arrived in the city. People were displaced in the eastern quarter to allow space for the envoys to arrive with the royals. The massive farmland that surrounded Cypoli paused in their works to watch the royals pass by. Royals with enough wealth to toss coins to the farmers and among the veterans of the eastern quarter. Some may see the tossing of the coins as charity, but in all honesty, it was more of a showing of wealth than anything else. Sure, there was an occasional guildie in the coins, but for the most part they were kopii that were tossed with a few guildie inside as the wealthy queens, ladies, and nobles of the 4 kingdoms laughed at the mad dash of people running after the coins. A tradition that started when the Patriarch used to visit the cities and towns of Stromer. He would gift gold coins so often that it actually caused the price of gold to drop in Stromer, and the generosity was so legendary that the other nobles sought to imitate. And as Adansi knew very well, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery that mediocrity can pay to greatness. And still, Adansi watched over the flatterers' flock through the streets of Cypoli on their way to the palace. The first to arrive was General Twist, a very experienced general who led her forces against invaders who came from across the ocean. When her forces were pushed back and her kingdom, the Iron Kingdom of the West, was nearly completely conquered, he allied with the Patriarch, who at the time was just a prince of the city of Cypoli. When she came to the city and she wasn't offered a chair to sit in, she sat on one of her slaves so she could speak to the then Prince of Cypoli, eye to eye. When she left the slave behind, telling the prince that she had plenty of chairs like that at home. It was enough to gain the support she needed, and it was the beginning of the War of Unification. General Twist brought with her many slaves from the War of Unification and from her wars across the ocean. Her envoy was the largest, as she brought many slaves, both as tribute to her patriarch and as a form of negotiation for her own political cause. In Stromer, enslavement could not exceed a period of 7 years, and by the end of the 7 years they would be free folk and could earn pay through apprenticeship and, in time, earn citizenship, an act that would have a large impact on General Twist's wealth, when most of her wealth would soon age out and walk away. So she would have to persuade the Patriarch to change the laws of enslavement and manumission. General Twist's young sister, Fletcher, was adopted by the Patriarch as his own daughter, a common enough practice with kings to adopt the children or sisters of your bride to add them to the royal family. Still, the Patriarch was smart enough to keep Fletcher in the city of Cipely, both to keep himself safe and to keep Fletcher safe. General Twist had killed most of the rest of her own family to get where she is now, and there was no illusion. She would be willing to kill if it got her further. The next envoy to arrive was from New Kingdom of the North. It was just called New Kingdom. No one really knew why. By the time anyone asked, New Kingdom was centuries old. Princess River of New Kingdom was the youngest of the visiting royals. She was 2 years old when her mother, Queen Singer, immolated herself. As New Kingdom fell to the combined forces of Cipely and the Iron Kingdom, and Queen Singer's husband fell to enemy forces, she was given an ultimatum from the Patriarch. She could surrender, or she could watch her kingdom burn. She agreed to surrender if she could have a funeral to her husband first. The Patriarch agreed, delivering her husband's body along with a squad of his soldiers, expecting a trick from Queen Singer, as she built a funeral pyre outside of the city with both her and her daughter in attendance. As Queen Singer wailed for her husband, she yelled that the Patriarch would never have her, nor her kingdom. So she jumped into her husband's pyre, clutching her daughter close. The Patriarch plunged his arms into the flames to free young River from her dying mother's arms, and on that day the young princess became in charge of New Kingdom. Even now, Princess River still had scars along her entire body from those burns, scars that she showed openly because any who dared mock her scars would themselves be burned as well, with hot iron. Even at 9 years old, Princess River had killed 3 different regions and fought off half a dozen assassination attempts. She was also an ardent supporter of the Patriarch because her new kingdom thrived selling salt and wood to Cipely. So the Princess of New Kingdom would support her adopted father, because her adopted father supported her as well. The third envoy to arrive came from the Marsh Kingdom of the East, a very religious kingdom that had the previous king declare war on the Patriarch by allying with the invaders from over the sea. The rules of the Marsh Kingdom were so strict that only the royals could marry royals. So the old king was married first to his mother, and when she died he was married to his sister, Lady Glory. The harshest battles were against the Marsh Kingdom, as the Patriarch found army after army full of soldiers willing to die for their king, for their god. However, it was Lady Glory who proposed peace to the Patriarch in an unusual fashion. She had sent a diplomatic envoy with a rug that was rolled up, and when the rug was brought to the Patriarch and unrolled, it was Lady Glory inside. Impressed by this, the Patriarch granted Lady Glory an audience as they spoke through the night and created a new plan to overthrow the old king. Lady Glory returned to her kingdom the next day and slew her brother husband in his sleep. And as she was pregnant, she was declared the ruler of the Marsh Kingdom, and she too surrendered to the Patriarch, 9 months later giving birth to a son, the next in line, after Lady Glory. And while there are rumors that the heir of the Marsh Kingdom is actually the son of the Patriarch, and not of the old king, those rumors are kept low because the Patriarch had adopted Lady Glory's son as his own, so it matters little whose son it was, as long as he was a son of glory. The young prince, Dagon, was believed to be fated for big things, but he is still a young boy, and no one knows how he will turn out. All they know is that Dagon is finally old enough to participate in the festival with his Patriarch. The final kingdom to participate was also the last one to fall to the Patriarch's unification war. The kingdom of Quarry, to the south, was led by King Laurel, an accomplished warrior herself, especially in leading charges with massive dinosaurs that devastated her enemies. One such victory, where she released massive triceratops against her enemies by blowing trumpets, actually had some of the triceratops turn on her own troops. It is said after surveying the remains of the battle that she said, "One more victory like this and we won't survive." And the Patriarch's campaigns through Quarry were some of the longest, because King Laurel kept using dinosaurs, traps, the land, and even the weather itself to resist the Patriarch's forces. And still, when his forces besieged her castle and her people starved, she finally surrendered to the Patriarch on the stipulation that she kept her title of king, and the Patriarch accepted because he had already given himself a title that was greater than king. So the Patriarch adopted King Laurel as a daughter, despite the fact that she was old enough to be his mother, both as a form of humiliation for her, not even good enough to marry and equal to a literal child from New Kingdom, and also as a form of protection from her. Rumors of the fact that she killed every single man who ever slept with her by cutting off their head and hanging them outside her door was enough to give even the Patriarch pause. Still, the king of Quarry arrived in Sipoli, eager to whet her many appetites of the city, and still Adansi watched over these people as they arrived, more than a little bored. Royals were usually the most boring people, in her mind. They reminded her of children pretending to be something important, wearing silly clothes, speaking big words they don't understand, and getting upset when people don't immediately treat them like they are someone more special than the stars and sea. The difference is the children playing pretend knew they were playing pretend, and they could try to come up with something different, or at least creative. Royals acted like their struggles made them purely unique and expected everyone to agree with them. A powerful woman with the title of king that would cut off the head of any man who slept with her? There were dozens of women in the city like that, including the prostitutes who worked in the graveyard. Accomplished generals and warriors? Adansi had seen many, and every time they were always the greatest general who ever lived, until they weren't. And they always lost. Scarred for life because her mother was so obsessed with her husband she couldn't see the child in her arms? It would be harder for Adansi to find a child without scars. What truly made them unique wasn't the ways they showed themselves to the world, but all of the ways they wanted to hide themselves from the world. The little ways they were people, not royals, but people. For Adansi saw people, she saw a story worth telling. She saw that King Laurel collected carvings and paintings of dinosaurs from all over Primeval, dreaming of the day she see things like the Quetzalcoatlus or a Mosasaurus of the distant continents, and the closest she would ever get is through that art. Art she felt too ashamed to share with anyone, not even willing to share that with the men she killed. The embarrassment was that bad. Adansi saw how Lady Glory loved honey cakes so much that she ordered extra, saying it's for her son, only for her to eat them all because her son doesn't like the honey cakes. An open secret in Lady Glory's court, and yet it is also one that her husband never noticed, and that Lady Glory hopes he never loves her enough to learn. Adansi saw how in Lady Glory's heart love and anger are tied together, and Adansi saw the battles Lady Glory fought to keep that anger from her son. Adansi saw how Princess River would hire servant girls to pretend to be friends with her, so she could pretend for a few hours a week that she is a normal, non-royal girl, not because River hates the royal life, but because the young princess has only ever seen royalty as responsibility. She has only seen allies turn to enemies, and friendship to her has always been transactional. And the princess still doesn't realize those children she plays with would be friends with her, even without payment. River might be worth visiting another time. And then there was General Twist. She enjoyed feeling powerful. She loved the feeling enough that she would only ever play games that she would win. But she wouldn't deal with the humiliation of ordering someone else to lose. She didn't care if that meant ordering slaves to play games that they didn't know against her, just to feel the thrill of winning. Desire for power was so strong she would enslave her own loyal nobles if she felt that there was a slight against her, real or imagined. She didn't care how it affected others. She would feel powerful even if that meant crushing every ant around her, never knowing, never challenging, but calling herself a champion. In Adansi's eyes, she watched these leaders enter the palace, and she followed behind, ready to see the patriarch with her own eyes. She had seen him in the memories, stories, artifice, and of course through the eyes of others, but it was finally here that she could see the hero of Cipoli, the first Patriarch of Stromer, Patriarch Mansa. Her first observation about him was despite the fact that he was a royal his entire life, she did see the familiar spark of something meant for legacy. Mansa saw himself as a hero, and he was willing to take heroic action, even if the consequences didn't always reflect his intentions. Heroes, unlike royals, were a lot more interesting to Adansi. To Adansi, the difference between a hero and a royal was the difference between a child pretending to cook for their mother and a child who is cooking for their mother. If the child made the right choices, the only difference was time. To Adansi, the difference between a royal and a villain was the difference between a child pretending to dig up treasure and a child who was digging up in the mines. If the child made the wrong choices, then the only difference was time. So Adansi continued to watch from the back of the crowd as people pressed forward to touch the patriarch's clothes or hands. They were so obsessed with greatness and how they saw the patriarch as someone above them that they didn't see him as mortal as them. His blue and gold robes flowed around him as he briefly addressed each of the royals and members of the envoys. Adansi heard title after title, name after name. Everyone was someone trying to sound important, or they were related to someone important. Titles, families, relations, and other stuffy terms that Adansi was immediately bored with. Everyone bored her so much, but she had to remain patient as the patriarch came to her finally. Everyone else barely shook the patriarch's hand, looking down, maybe kissing the iron ring on his hand if they wanted to gain his attention. And yet, when the patriarch approached Adansi, she took his hand and she looked him in the eyes. It may not sound like much to most people. Eye contact was not something that Adansi did often. It made her very uncomfortable to look people in the eyes, like there was a time knife between her eyes that was digging into her brain and causing her to bleed down her spine. Also, she never knew what was or wasn't an appropriate amount of eye contact, so it was usually easier to look just above their heads or at their mouths. So looking Mansa in the eyes, she showed him something beyond his normal comprehension. She did not like doing it, both because it made her uncomfortable and because it made everyone else uncomfortable. Still, this was a time that needed her to be uncomfortable, and that the Patriarch would be paying for it, once over. Adansi was uncertain if he was wealthy enough to handle the cost. Through the Patriarch's eyes, he saw an impossibly large being of clockwork, silver, and something beyond the stars. The Patriarch stood on the hand of this impossibly large being. It had many dozens of arms, hundreds of hands. Many arms were restrained by chains that were so massive, individual links were larger than the stars. Yet this being broke the chains with ease, and the face of the being had no face. And yet it had two massive eyes, larger than swirling galaxies, eyes that saw everything he was, and he could not understand what this being was thinking. All he could see was this impossibly powerful being held him in its hand. It didn't even have to do anything to hurt him. All it would have to do was let him go, and he would fall forever. The only reason he wasn't dead was that this impossibly powerful being hadn't decided what to do with him. Yet. And as this vision faded, the Patriarch realized that he was still standing before this young girl who was shaking his hand. One eye covered by her hair and the other eye looking down like she was nervous to be meeting him. He was used to people being nervous to meet him, but after that vision with the impossibly eldritch being, he was certain that this girl before him was something that was dangerously powerful. "What are you?" he asked the young girl. She glanced upwards towards him with her eye before she pulled her hand back, and she produced 3 different cards, showing the cards towards him. Each of them were different king's cards. He stared at them, not understanding what the cards meant, before she spoke. "I am a storyteller. I am a diplomat," the young girl said, repeating the same sentence twice, making it clear that she meant the same word in 2 different definitions. In Primeval, the words for diplomat and storyteller were the same words, so the young girl could have easily been saying, "I am a diplomat, I am a storyteller," or even just repeating that she was a storyteller twice, or that she was a diplomat twice. Before the Patriarch could ask anything else, another noble from the Iron Kingdom shook his hands and introduced himself, as the little girl disappeared into the crowd where he couldn't see her anymore. The rest of the day felt like a flourish of speeches, doublespeak, political promises, political threats, and still the Patriarch thought about the little storyteller. She was hardly the only diplomat title. The most other diplomats were diplomats from somewhere, or they were storytellers that told specific stories, like tales from across the sea, or stories from the kingdom of Quarry. Still, as the day went on, it felt like everything was swirling and flying by so quickly. It was a whirlwind, and when finally the last meeting was done, Mansa finally settled into his sleep and he began to dream. He dreamed of the being with many hands, and he saw gears beyond the eldritch being's hand. Thankfully, it wasn't watching him, but he could still see the eyes of pure light in the faceless face that watched the distant stars and planets, all of which were balanced on gears and rings that slowly rotated beyond. As Mansa looked down where he stood, and he could see Stromer far below. Primeval was so large. Stromer felt so small, Mansa could barely balance on it as he looked down. This being's hand was transparent, and Primeval was below him. It was smaller than the hand of the eldritch being, and he was aware of how small he was. Primeval was smaller than just the hand of this eldritch being, so much smaller that this being didn't even bother looking down at it. And Stromer was so much smaller than Primeval, he could barely spot the continent on his world, and even as he focused as hard as he couldn't see Cipely. He knew where Cipely was supposed to be on Stromer, but even the largest city of Stromer was far too small for him to see. And if the city was too small to be seen, then the palace was even smaller. And he was far smaller than even that. Even as Mansa looked below, trying to see more of the world as he understood it, he finally realized that the being was watching him look below, and yet he refused to look up. All he could do is look down at the world below and try not to feel how small he truly was before the size of this world. And he knew that there were so many other worlds out there if he just looked up, but he refused, trying to focus on his tiny part of the world and see what else he could see of his domain. When Mansa woke up, he saw a single playing card resting on his pillow. The card was one of the kings he saw yesterday with the young diplomat. He was supposed to be a powerful leader, the patriarch of all of Stromer, the hero who united them all, and in that morning he felt frozen in fear. It was a warm morning, and yet he felt like he was in the frozen fields of Shu, and yet all he could do was pick up the card as he traveled to the quarters of his major domo. His major domo was a very well-organized man and one of the most loyal people he had ever met. His major domo was once the major domo of his own father, who helped raise Mansa back when he was the heir apparent to being a prince, and when he became a prince. And during the Wars of Unification, he even took an arrow that was meant for Mansa, and Mansa considered him to be one of the only people he would ever consider as a friend. Patriarch Mansa had no idea what the name of his major domo was. Mansa knocked first on the major domo's door and opened the door to see that the major domo was not in his room, so there was only one other place the major domo could be. So he traveled down the hall to one of the nearby kitchens. The palace had multiple kitchens, and this one was meant only for the patriarch's closest staff, and it was the only place the major domo would eat. Mansa walked into the room to speak to his major domo, and when he walked into the kitchen, again, he froze when he saw who the major domo was speaking to. The major domo was always a serious old man with graying hair, and he always stood up straight. He had a commanding presence, and he stood even taller than the patriarch, even in his old age. He was always professional, calculating, and almost cold. And yet here he was, laughing at what his guest was saying. Sitting on the table, the same young girl who yesterday said she was the storyteller. When the major domo saw his boss enter the kitchen, he stood up straight when he saw Mansa, and he cleared his throat. "Oh, hello, Your Excellence. Adansi here is the daughter of a diplomat, and she is a storyteller," the major domo said as she nodded and she spun around to take a good look at the patriarch. "Hello, you must be Mansa, son of Mason," she said as the major domo cleared his throat. He's the Patriarch of Stromer," he corrected Adansi as she tilted her head. "Oh, I did not know you had a new child. Congratulations on the child named Stromer. Is that a Kopi name?" Adansi asked, which brought a small chuckle from the major domo's mouth. "No, he's the leader of the continent of Stromer. He's like a king to other kings," the major domo said as Adansi made the connection. "Ah, thank you, Revere," she said to the major domo, as Mansa realized that was the major domo's name, a name he hadn't have heard since he was a young child. Adansi turned to the patriarch and she spoke. O great King of Kings, I look upon your works upon mighty Stromer, and I despair, she said, which felt like a nonsense poetic quote, but it also made him certain that Adansi was aware, if not the cause of his dreams last night. Revere, would you kindly escort Adansi away from the palace, find her parents, and send them back to where they came from? I'm certain we can tell stories with each other during a less stressful time after the end of the Odo Festival, he asked Revere, as he spoke like she wasn't even there. A very common practice adults do around children, and Revere blanched a bit before he spoke against his patriarch. Sire, is that wise? She is a storyteller from the distant lands of Lockhart, and new relations beyond Stromer would be wise for us politically, the major domo asked as Dance said only one thing. She too pretended that they weren't there. Lockhart, she said as neither man acknowledged what she said. Tell her parents. We just cannot tell stories during the Odo Festival. Schedule them another time, and they can do it without their daughter around discussing adult matters, Mansa said to his major domo as Adansi continued to talk to herself. Adult matters only, like telling stories, playing games, making friends, wearing masks, dancing dances, and singing songs, Adansi said as Mansa casually spoke to her. Do not speak unless spoken to, he said to the young girl, who only shook her head and covered her mouth with her hand. As Revere, the major domo, sighed, and he grabbed the girl's other hand, and he led her away from the patriarch, who took a sigh as he made a thought to himself that he would never extend relations to Lockhart. But he figured that the major domo would fix the situation as he grabbed some bread and he chewed on it, and he noticed that the card had something written on it in Stromerian script. Do not speak unless spoken to, it said over the card with the painting of the king on it. Disturbed, the patriarch tossed the card, made from cotton, into a nearby fire to let it burn. He was worried it wouldn't burn. Thankfully, it did burn. That done, the patriarch continued his duties for the Odo Festival. There were masks to see, stalls to oversee, and people to meet, as the festival continued. His adopted son, Dagon, son of Lady Glory, was finally old enough to participate in the great race. He would get a chance to run from Cypele to the nearby village of New Leaf. His son would run to represent outrunning an evil spirit, and the patriarch would represent the vile ghost. Both of them in masks as they ran to New Leaf. There, the mask would be given to another child who would run to another village, and Mansa would follow the new child. And so on until the patriarch made his way back to Cypele. He could give the children the chance to win, however, he never gave them an advantage, and even after all of these years, the children never won the great race. So, as they prepared for the race that night, the memories of Adansi and the nightmare faded as the patriarch prepared his mask, and his son's mask was prepared as well. That night, as Kinich began to set, it felt like the entire city was out watching the great race. The patriarch was dressed in green and gold robes, his crown left at the palace, while his mask was made to look like a large crocodile. The wooden mask clacked while it moved, and the patriarch could see through the eyes of the mask, and underneath his eyes, in malachite coal, his eyes were made to look green and gold as well. In the light of the torches, the patriarch's costume made him look exactly like a crocodile that learned to walk upright, and he finally saw what Dagon was wearing. There were always a few different masks and costumes that were used throughout the Odo Festival, but this year they were dressing up the children as mammalian prey. Dagon was dressed as rat-like ears with the mask that matched the brown clothes Dagon was wearing. Dagon's eyes, behind the mask, stared up at his father, and despite living 6 winters, Dagon had yet to speak to anyone, not even his mother. He did, however, speak with his hands, which was a helpful form of communication. Good luck at the race tonight, but don't think I will take it easy on you just because you're my son, the patriarch told his son, who did a small laugh before he signed back. Don't think it'll be easy for you either, he signed to the patriarch's laugh, as the festival began in earnest and the patriarch walked out to the gathered crowd who surrounded the palace. The patriarch stared down at his people below, and he could see many faces all looking up at him. In that moment he could feel praise and adoration from below up to him. He remembered those dark days before the unification. He remembered seeing starving people out in the streets. He remembered watching distant and not so distant fires from the walls of his palace. Every day there was a new story about another raid. Food was getting harder to bring into the city. Even as the prince of the city, he barely had enough food even with his guards. His guards were hungry enough to skim from the top, and he dreamt of that end. If every tribe, every village, every city all bowed to the same flag, no one would ever grow hungry again. No more violence, no more war. All of Stromer, under one patriarch, indivisible, with food and protection for all. And here he was looking out over his success. He held his arms up, listening to the cheers for a moment further, before the patriarch dropped his arms and the voices of Cybele dropped as well. He had real power, the success of years of fighting and conquest, but in the end, it was all worth it as the patriarch spoke. We remember those who passed on in the Odo Festival. For though these next few months they can visit us again, our ancestors, our friends, our families, those who fought for unification, those who died fighting the beasts of our world, and those who died living their lives. We honor the people and the animals, young and the old, the men and the women. We honor those who were loyal to me, and we mourn those who were rebellious. But as we all know, death is not forever. The dead are given a chance to walk among us again, to visit us again, and we know that they too will live again. However, not every spirit that visits us during the Odo Festival is benevolent. Some of the spirits are cruel, hungry, even malicious, as they seek us out. We seek to chase them away, to scare them away, and to keep them from entering our homes. So, our first great race of the festival, my great race, is a race between a dangerous spirit and an innocent child. The child, my very own Dagon, will lead the race. He will run from Cybele to the village of New Leaf, and he will pass on his mask to another child to run from me, and so on until we return. Let us hope this year that the forces of darkness do not catch up to the forces of innocence, the patriarch said to the cheers of the crowd, as Dagon immediately ran through the streets, and the patriarch gave him a few seconds before he threw himself over the edge of the palace walls, and he gave chase to his son. The patriarch's power was great. He once wrestled a Suchomimus to the ground after fighting for 3 days, and ever since, his strength, speed, and durability were all many times greater than that of his compatriots. There were those who thought that the patriarch, using greatly enhanced strength that no man could dare match, let alone a mere child, meant that the race was inherently unfair, and it should have been taken care of by someone else. All the Patriarch had to say was, "Do you think evil spirits play fair?" As the Patriarch ran through the streets, he could see Dagon not far ahead, making deliberate cuts through alleyways and even hopping up short walls to try and outrun his father. The Patriarch was confident this wouldn't work, but he was glad that his son was trying something different. Maybe this year the race would even leave the city? He was not sure as he pulled himself up to try and corner Dagon, for he knew it was a dead-end alley. Instead, as the costume clacked and rattled, the Patriarch saw that his son wasn't down the alley. It was just the Patriarch. He was confused for a moment until he could hear running steps behind him, as he turned and he saw a flash of brown as Dagon ran down a different street. Ah, he was going to use tricks to keep the Patriarch busy. Clever of him. But if Dagon was going to try and be clever, then there was no reason for the Patriarch to play nicely. The Patriarch ran after his son, plunging past the streets of the southern quarter. There, the torches were lit to light the way, and you could see people standing in the light by the sides of the street. The people were dressed in masks and costumes as well. Masks hid their faces and made them feel eerie, because despite these crowded streets, it was silent with only the sound of distant footsteps, the crackle of the torches, and his own breath as he followed down the streets to try and find out where his son ran off to. The streets were labyrinthian and were difficult to pinpoint where the steps were coming from. Sometimes it sounded like dozens of different people were running. Sometimes there was just one, and sometimes he heard none at all, and yet he kept pursuing his son through the southern quarter, Dagon just out of sight, but close enough that the Patriarch knew he was close. And yet he still followed, darting between the many eerie people on the streets. There were far more now than there was earlier, practically shoulder to shoulder, but they still jostled some to give him space. As he followed his son, trying not to look too closely at the eerie masks of those of the southern quarter. They were shaped and painted to look like people's faces, so realistic that the Patriarch would have thought that they were people's faces if it wasn't for their mouths. Most of them were missing their mouths entirely. Smooth-looking skin where their mouths should be. Others had the lower jaw removed, leaving only the glistening teeth of the upper mandible to glisten in the torchlight. Others had iron riveted to their faces, and then others had their mouths sewn shut. Still, he kept moving forward through the crowd and careful not to look too closely at their mouths. At the Temple of Justice, at the foot of the ziggurat, the Patriarch could see that his son ran up the steps of the ziggurat, and along the sides of the steps were more of these masked people, carrying torches in one hand, and in their other arms they carried small infants. As the Patriarch traveled up the steps, he could not help but pause his trek to admire how much work people put into their costumes this year. The eyes of each mask looked so sad they really looked like they were crying. Their lips pulled into a silent scream that actually looked like a real mouth and not paint on wood. It was their infants that really interested him, though. Their faces, too small for masks, they must have used makeup to make their infants look this way. The babies' faces were wizened, tired, decrepit, almost ancient-looking. Ancient-looking faces and hair on small infants with shrunken limbs and swollen bellies. The Patriarch continued his hike up to the top of the ziggurat, and there what he saw was not what he had expected. There were no other temples on the top of the ziggurat. There was no city beyond either. On top of the ziggurat, he could see the distant fire of the village of New Leaf, and he could see torches lining the many different stairs leading up the ziggurat. He could see the distant shape of someone running beyond into the darkness when the patriarch took down the steps. He had to tell himself to ignore the fact that the city disappeared, and the fact that the masks around him looked so familiar. He had to keep telling himself that they were indeed masks, because if they weren't masks, then what he was looking at was something much darker than an Odo Festival. He passed by masks with blood around the lips, women clutching infants to their breasts. Some of the infants were burned, others were missing half of their skin where he could see slick bone and rough muscle beneath. And those weren't the worst. The worst were those women still clutching the blankets, and their masks were smeared with the blood around the mouth. It reminded him of the last winter before the first year of unification. It reminded him of the stories of mothers in the city willing to eat their own infants to stay alive. There was even rumors of mothers eating their children alive because the hunger was so great. Mansa could not think about it for even a moment as he pushed himself into the jungle, with many different torches lining the path as he made his way forward, chasing after the distant running figure with white fur and long ears. Beyond the torches in the woods, he could see things lurking in the woods. Powerful beasts with glassy eyes that followed him, hoping he would step away from the path and into the darkness. And still the patriarch followed his son, getting closer and closer, and yet it felt further and further from his quarry. The mud pulled at his sandals, forcing him to drag himself forward, while his son easily sidestepped the mud, stepping on stones and getting closer and closer to New Leaf. Still, the patriarch reached out after his son, his hand barely missing to grab his son's white outfit, as the patriarch forced himself further and further after the figure in front of him, when the figure turned around and his heart nearly stopped. It wasn't his son. His son's hair was shorter than this, and his mask resembled a rat, but it lacked fur. The texture was painted on wood. Dagon was dressed in gray, made to resemble mouse fur. This figure had long hair that completely hid her head, leaving only the mask visible. The mask of a strange, white-furred mammal, long pink ears that stuck straight up. Her outfit was the same white as her mask, and the way she moved, she reminded the Patriarch of Adansi. She moved like the entire world was moving around her, and that she was herself standing still, hence her effortless movement. "Where is Dagon?" the Patriarch yelled at the strange girl, who pointed up at the village of New Leaf. "There, somewhere. Surely a father could find his son?" she asked the Patriarch as she skipped into the village, and the Patriarch rattled and clanked after her. Finally, inside the village of New Leaf, Patriarch saw more of these strange masks, and the children of the village were all lined up in the streets. All wore the same mask and the same dress as Adansi. The children were silent beneath the crackling of the torches. In the darkness, there were monsters and more masked adults with blood around their mouths. In desperation, the Patriarch reached out for the first mask when he heard Adanse's voice echo from every child. No, not from every child. From every child's mask. You have one chance to save your children. If you fail to choose your children, then the Odo who lurk in the darkness will feed. You may ask any question you want. You may get only honest answers except for if they are Dagon or what their name is. We will see if you are worthy of your title, for what patriarch could not identify their family. Even with a mask, the voice echoed as the patriarch called out into the darkness. Demon, let my child go. Let all of these children go. Undo your evil and leave us be. He called out into the darkness, only his own echo answering him. This was very strange. Every demon and devil he had fought before was prideful to a fault and would not leave him alone when he called out a challenge. So now he was mystified as he looked over the children of New Leaf. There were dozens of children, and he only ever saw Dagon a few times, usually from a distance, and he never even had a proper conversation with him. Dagon didn't speak, and he had no way of knowing anything about him that he loved or wanted to do. Wait, Dagon never spoke. He turned to the children as he asked, "What is the name of the largest star?" He asked the group as the word Kinich echoed across the village, except from one young boy at the end. The boy who only spoke with hands, as the patriarch crouched down to see the boy. The boy looked sickly and thin, his short hair was tangled, and he hardly looked like the son of a patriarch. He did not resemble a royal in any way. Still, the patriarch was sure that this boy was his boy, since he was the only one to speak with his hands. So the patriarch lifted his hand to the mask as Adansi's voice echoed from the mask. It sounded almost forlorn, like this demon regretted its choice and it was trying to give the patriarch a second chance. Are you sure he is the only child that needs to be saved? The mask echoed as the patriarch turned to all of the other children around, their masked faces turning to him. Their eyes were wide and fearful, but the patriarch had to be strong. He couldn't save everyone, and he couldn't try. Trying to save the world would only ever break his heart. It would be like trying to lift a mountain. He should know. He's tried to do both. I am here to save one, no more, no less. I am not responsible for anyone else, so their deaths do not weigh on me. The Patriarch of Stromer said as he removed his son's mask and he saw a familiar face. A face that looked so much like his own face when he was young. A face so familiar he was certain that this child was his. His son blinked like he was waking up, and the patriarch was so happy to see his son. For a moment he was at peace, until he saw his son's face turn to horror as he tried to run from the patriarch's grasp. "Get this monster away from me!" Dagon yelled as the others of the village rushed towards him, trying to free him from the patriarch's grasp. "I'm the patriarch. Dagon is my son. Unhand me!" The patriarch yelled as the villagers pulled him back, and he saw other children taken away by others in masks as he lifted his hand out. "Don't let them take the children away!" he yelled as he reached out far for them, only for a villager to stab him with their spear. The spear didn't penetrate, but it did hurt him as he turned to the villagers, all of whom were staring at him like he was a monster. And as he clacked when he moved, he realized that they must have thought he was an Odo. "Hold on, let me take off my mask," Mansa said as he slowly lifted his hands to his mask as he tried to remove the mask. His fingers could not find purchase on the wood. The wood felt smooth and cold, like it was made from the scales of a crocodile. Even as he struggled to remove the mask, he realized he couldn't get it off. "Okay, I cannot get the mask off, but I am the patriarch. I am," Mansa said, almost pleading with the crowd, as the crowd parted to reveal someone else in the same mask he was wearing earlier. She also wore green and gold, and despite being so much smaller than he was, everyone treated her like she was him. Dagon was even hugging Adansi, too scared to look at his real father. You are not the patriarch. You are a sad, scary Odo that started to chase this poor child. Go back to the shadows where you came from, Adansi said, almost shooing the patriarch. As in rage, he leapt towards her, his claws raking across her back as she turned to protect Dagon. His claws cut deep into her back, and red blood left her wounds as he realized that he had claws now. Whatever she did really he did make him into a monster. Even as she bled, she kept Dagon away from the fight as she spoke again. I will try to be diplomatic one last time. You forgotten beast of yesteryear. Leave this place and leave this child. I will do what I can to help you back to where you belong, or if you cannot leave this place, then I will show you the kind of power that you face. She warned him, and that angered him far more than seeing his son embrace this stranger. He was practically a stranger already to his child. However, he was powerful. Being powerful was what he always was, and if this little brat thought she could overpower him, then he would make her regret it. Mansa lunged forward as she moved in a way like time itself froze for her own defense. Adansi took a deep breath. She closed her eyes. She pushed Dagon behind her back as she inhaled and exhaled. When she opened her eyes were on fire with rage and pain that Mansa did not know was possible for any human to possess. Dagon was behind her as she held out one hand to grab his neck, and the other hand curled into a fist as it plunged into his stomach. And for the first time in his life, Mansa lost the wind in his lungs as he dangled from her hand. His blood dripped from his mouth as he tried to catch his breath, and his calls for help only came out as wet moans. Despite her being so much shorter than him, in that moment she felt like a titan dangling him over a cliff. I gave you a chance. I gave you many chances, son of Mason. Your title was your mask, your bludgeon, and who you are. So now I give you a new mask. Let's see the man you can become. If you can become anything else, but be warned, you have until the end of the Odo Festival to learn your lesson. Otherwise, you will spend your days lurking in darkness, chased away by torchlight and dawn's purifying flame, she said, as she let him go, and Mansa found himself in the mud outside of the village of New Leaf. He could see inside the village. He could see Adansi comforting his son, and in time the mask is passed on to another child. A child that Adansi chased, both of them laughing and Adansi letting her run ahead. That wasn't how it was supposed to be played. It was supposed to be an honest challenge. Why was she doing this to him? So he reluctantly made his way back to the eastern quarter of the city. There, others saw him, but they did not immediately turn on him in fear, like they did in New Leaf. Still, though, none recognized him as the Patriarch. So he found a place not far from the forge of a one-eyed blacksmith as he fell asleep, and he dreamed of falling from the hand of the impossibly powerful eldritch thing. And yet, no matter how far he fell, the ground never got any closer to him, even as he fell further from the eldritch thing.